is that on most Drupal and social platforms, I go by ManClue, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions or want to talk about anything that you see today. So, as many of you will know, in December of last year, we had the exciting release of Drupal 10 stable. Quick show of hands, who in the audience has already played around with Drupal 10? Oh, that's pretty good. Anybody actually using it in production today? Oh, a couple of hands, okay. And then this summer we actually had the release of Drupal 10.1, which for anybody who watched the Dries note from Pittsburgh, he referred to it as one of the most feature-packed incremental releases that Drupal has had in a long, long time. So who here has played around with 10.1? Okay, still not bad. And then a few of you will probably know that later this year we're actually going to be getting another feature release, Drupal 10.2, which is currently in release. So all of this sounds great, but probably the reason why many of you are here is to really understand what's new. What are some of the features that you can get by moving to Drupal 10? So I'm going to talk today about some of the features that I'm excited about. Again, there's lots more that we could go through, but for the next few minutes, let's talk about some of the features that make Drupal 10 compelling for me. So certainly Drupal 10 is fast, or probably more accurately put, faster than ever. So if we look at the data, and this is Google's data, this is not something that the Drupal community has come up with. If you look at how Drupal compares to sort of competing CMS solutions, content management solutions, it's certainly well ahead. And if you look at the most recent set of data here, you can see that by starting a site using Drupal as opposed to a competing solution, you end up with a pretty substantial head start in terms of being able to achieve solid Core Web Vitals scores. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Core Web Vitals, it's really a ranking metric that rolls up to a lot of different sort of performance and user experience metrics. So it's going to help you with your SEO. It's going to also help you create a better user experience. So I think those are two pretty solid reasons. Now we can also talk about some specific things that actually help to contribute to these solid Core Web Vitals scores. So lazy loading is something that's been in Drupal core now since mid Drupal 9. But as of 10.1, lazy loading works in core as well for responsive images, as well as embed content like video players or other kinds of embedded social media. Since Drupal 8, we've also had BigPipe, but as of 10.1, it can use custom placeholder content, which means, again, you're going to have reduced cumulative layout shifts. So you can see in this animation how, without the custom placeholder content, when the sort of deferred content gets loaded in by BigPipe, it causes the page to shift down. And by having a placeholder that better approximates what's going to be loaded in, it creates a better user experience, and again, is going to help your Core Web Vitals scores. A couple of other examples. I mean, there's lots more we could go into, but a couple of other examples. Again, in 10.1, we have JS minification on the fly and WebP support. One other thing I'll point out on this slide is that you may have noticed that the bullets are two different colors. As we go through, you'll see that some of the slides are in light blue, and that's because they're in sort of version 10.1 or newer, just to sort of call out a little bit which are the newer features. So I won't necessarily talk to those as we go through, but just to sort of highlight that's a feature that you can watch for. So I think Suzanne mentioned earlier that multilingual support was one of the things that had brought Evolving Web to start using Drupal, and that certainly was my experience as well. And so I think it's really exciting that even in Drupal 10, the Drupal community is not sort of resting on its laurels, but continuing to build on multilingual support. So there is an upgraded translation management system, making it easier than ever to sort of manage your translations and translation workflows, and then also the ability to really use that entity system that's at the core of modern Drupal now to manage custom languages as well. There is also improved language detection. So, I may travel to Quebec next week, and just because I'm in Quebec doesn't mean that I necessarily want to be served content in French. And so Drupal now, as of 10.1, will do a better job of actually being able to detect your language preferences from your browser settings so that you don't have to rely on sort of, GeoIP lookups or those kinds of techniques to be able to serve people content in their preferred language. There is also a more customizable and configurable language switcher. So in the past, you might have had to do custom twig templates or pre-process functions or some sort of combination of the two to get the language switcher to kind of look and react the way that you wanted. Whereas a lot more of those can be achieved now directly through site configuration. One of the things that I personally think is one of the best features of Drupal 10 is something that it doesn't have, which is support for Internet Explorer. Right? So by dropping support for Internet Explorer, it means Drupal's front end now can embrace much more modern development techniques. So a simple example is the new Olivero theme. This was actually started in Drupal 9 as experimental, but when you install Drupal 10, the default theme will be Olivero as the front end. Probably a lot of people in this room, when they develop and deploy a Drupal site to production, are going to be using custom themes anyway. But I think having this sort of a very modern, very accessible theme as people's first experience when they install Drupal is really powerful and really sets them off on a good foot. So the Olivero theme was definitely developed with accessibility in mind. Was reviewed and given a big thumbs up by the National Federation for the Blind in the US, and they actually use Drupal for their own site, so I think it really sort of speaks to the level of commitment to accessibility that the Drupal community has. It uses a variety of very modern CSS techniques, like CSS grid, intersection observer, and CSS variables. And was really built on a whole sort of component system, atomic design principles, and you can really see it in how sort of cohesive it feels as a front-end theme. So when you use Olivero out of the box, it's going to look probably something like this, but it's very easy to make it look like this, or even like this. And all of that you can do through configuration directly in the theme settings page. And this is not like the color module that some of you may have used in older versions of Drupal that like generated a whole bunch of CSS. And then if you made some tweak to it, it would like regenerate all of your CSS. This is actually just a front end for setting CSS variables that the rest of the theme will now be able to use. And so it's a good example of using CSS variables, again, the modern front-end techniques made possible by dropping support for Internet Explorer and some of the benefits that brings to people using Drupal. Another example is the views responsive grids. So in Drupal 10, if you're creating a view, you have this new display called responsive grid. Has the configuration that you see on the left, very simple to set up. And then you can see in the animation how nicely it works in terms of really providing a great experience across a variety of different devices and device widths primarily. So again, very forward-thinking in terms of its use of things like CSS Grid. Actually was so innovative that it got a write-up published on CSS Tricks. And I think to me, it's great that it's not creating excitement just within the Drupal community, but even sort of getting some notice in the wider web development community as well. So that's Olivero as kind of the front-end theme, but Drupal also has a new back-end theme as well, so the Claro admin theme, which again, thoroughly tested for accessibility, really built around a cohesive design system, also sort of JavaScript driven and decoupled in terms of how it interacts with the back end. And so, definitely something that can be very powerful and customizable for your specific needs. Now, something that also is getting a lot of excitement in the Drupal community right now is called single directory components, and where traditionally, Drupal themes have tended to have sort of all of the templates in one folder, all of the CSS in another folder, and all of the JavaScript in another folder. has been somewhat challenging sometimes for people getting into Drupal to really understand how to customize some of the elements in there, because they have to find the right files within each of those directories, and those can all have numerous deep levels of subdirectories as well. So the idea of single directory components is for something like a CTA component having the twig file, the CSS file, and the JavaScript all together, so that as a front-end developer, you can go in and have all of those pieces together, easy to find and work on together. So it's in 10.1 as an experimental module. There's actually work underway to move more of the existing core components towards this sort of single directory structure. So definitely something that's going to be an ongoing process of making Drupal easier and easier to work with as a front-end developer. There are also a variety of updated interfaces, so there's lots of great work being done in terms of making Drupal just more and more intuitive to use. So within 10.1, you can see in the animation the updated interface for reusing an existing field. So where before you would just have a drop-down with a name, now it'll tell you sort of what type of field it is, even give you a little bit of information about it. So it becomes, again, giving the user a lot more feedback in terms of the things that they're choosing between. And in a similar way, the bulk content operations interface has been thoroughly overhauled and again made much more intuitive. In 10.2, there's an upcoming change to the experience for creating a new field, which we can see on this slide. And again, much more visual, using icons, having descriptions to these different categories, and overall just making Drupal much more welcoming to people who are just starting to use it. So we've already talked earlier this morning about inclusivity, and particularly for people using assistive devices with Drupal, and really the commitment that Drupal has shown even for things like Layout Builder in terms of really being able to support people with a variety of different technology that they may be using to access a particular site, even on the back end. So in terms of Drupal 10.2, there is now a set of Night Watch accessibility tests built into core, which is again going to make it much easier for the Drupal accessibility team to sort of catch any potential regressions or issues that might arise around accessibility. On the bottom right is something that I thought it would be interesting to call out for people using modern versions of Drupal. If you haven't used the editorially module, it might be something to look into. It's basically a contrib module that will offer your content creators immediate feedback when they save a piece of content in terms of, are there issues around the way the headings have been structured? Are there ways, maybe they've put a table into the cell that has some accessibility issues. By calling those out right away, it becomes less of an effort for your teams if they come back with a tool like a site improve or a dubbot to have a long list. If they can catch those issues as they're creating content, it becomes maintaining accessibility compliance a much simpler process on an ongoing basis. Another example is sort of directly within those modern Drupal themes, a commitment to using sort of HTML5 tags to really provide much better context to assistive devices like screen readers in terms of what are the areas of content that are being depicted on the page. There's also been some pretty significant focus in Drupal around making it easy for content creators. And in Drupal 10, probably the biggest improvement is moving to CKEditor 5. So moving from CKEditor 4, which was the default in Drupal 9, to CKEditor 5 may just sound like a version increase, but you can really think about this as being kind of a complete rewrite under the hood, in the same way as moving from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 was for our community. So it's much more extensible now, much more compatible with modern JavaScript frameworks. And then there is also this ability to have premium features with CKEditor 5. So having real-time collaboration, inline comments, and so on. Here's an example of some of those features in action. And so These are the kinds of features that traditionally people may have done before putting content into Drupal using tools like Google Docs, some of those other kinds of collaboration tools. But to be able to do that kind of collaboration within Drupal, I think will be really powerful for a variety of different applications. Think about like intranets, collaborating on policy documents, some of those kinds of things as well. Something else that is new in 10.1 for CKeditor 5 is support for what is called auto format. So it's the ability to use sort of markdown style syntax to be able to apply formatting without leaving your keyboard. So to be able to bold and italicize, set headings, create bulleted and numbered lists. These are the kinds of things. So I would say Markdown in general is probably something that's most familiar to more technical users. But things like being able to create ordered lists and bulleted lists inline is pretty common these days. So it's something that you can do in Google Docs, you can do in collaboration tools like Slack. And so having this in Drupal 10, I think, is going to be a significant improvement and content creation experience benefit. The media integration for CKeditor 5 was completely rewritten. So some of the features like being able to set alignment or whether or not, let's say, an image required a caption, all of these used to be done in kind of a modal overlay that would sort of interrupt the experience of content creation, kind of obscure the content that you're actually working with. And so being able to do these in kind of more of a ribbon overlay really keeps the content creator more in context, gives them a much better experience of making some of these kinds of decisions. Drupal 10 is also highly secure. I mean, Drupal, I would say, for a long time now, has had a reputation for being secure. It's one of the reasons why it's trusted by national governments, international corporations, big players in banking and insurance and a variety of other spaces. And an improvement that's underway in the Drupal community is an initiative called automatic updates. So it is actually available as a contrib project today, but the work is underway to get that into Drupal core. Essentially what it'll do is use Composer in a sandbox within the same server, install any updates, do things like run database updates, and if everything goes smoothly, then it'll switch basically between the sandbox and the production environments. But it also provides a set of APIs so that if your site needs to do some custom things as part of that overall process, maybe tie into some kind of CI/CD pipelines, you definitely have a lot of flexibility to customize that as well. I will point out that today it's not really intended for use on production sites where Git deployment is sort of the standard. So in that scenario, you would probably want to run automatic updates locally and then deploy whatever changes are created out of that. And also currently it does not work with multi-sites as well. Drupal 10 is also always in the process of renewing. So we talked a little bit earlier about kind of that 6-month release cadence. And also it seems like we're kind of settling into like a 2-year major release cycle, partially driven by the need to stay up to date with supported versions of underlying technologies like PHP or Symfony. And so what that means is that there's always kind of new capabilities. It also helps with things like staying up to date with the most performant versions of PHP. But I think also that 6-month cadence has also been a big driver for innovation in the community as a whole. There's also a newer initiative around sort of streamlining core, so taking out things that aren't necessarily well supported or at least well used by the community. So can think of, we talked about the color module earlier. Quick Edit is another one that, evidence suggests there aren't a lot of sites using. And so taking out the pieces that aren't really being used widely by the community means that, it's faster to run automated tests. There's a lower effort in terms of, gauging the potential impact of, upcoming changes on, again, parts of Drupal core that aren't necessarily widely used. In the same way, we have those new themes that we talked about earlier, so some of the older themes now are going to be moved out of core. And all of these things being moved out of core doesn't mean that they just go away. They're actually being moved into contrib projects, so any sites that, for whatever reason, still need to use them, can continue to do so. And in fact, moving into Contrib can actually be a benefit for some of these projects because it may be possible to sort of have new life, see new levels of faster innovation by being in the Contrib space. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out for some of these Contrib projects. And what I find really exciting about Drupal 10 is that it's also a hotbed for innovation. So lots of really, really interesting things going on in the Drupal space right now, and one of them being the event condition action module. So, okay, I can't see the video on my screen. So what we can see here is basically BPMN notation, which is actually not specific to Drupal, but a broader standard in sort of the business workflow space, but the ability to sort of visually define how the Drupal site should respond to different kinds of, in this case, event conditions and actions. That's what ECA stands for. So as a site builder, you can go in and configure the site to really define custom business logic without having to write custom code. So that leads to sort of lower technical debt on an ongoing basis and makes the site much easier to maintain. And the other thing that I love about ECA is that you can see if you do even have to do some decent job of labeling these different steps, the definition itself becomes a really good visual reference you can take to a non-technical user and say, this is how we set up the site to respond to these specific actions. Is that appropriate for our business? And they don't have to sort of understand code to be able to give you feedback on those things. So that was a pretty simple example in terms of responding to a piece of content being published. You can obviously build these things out to be much more complex, but I think this is a really powerful space, and it's actually a pretty broad ecosystem as well. So definitely something to check out in Drupal 10. Something else that's being worked on pretty actively right now is same page preview. Currently a Contrib module, but the idea being that it will be making its way to port at some point, potentially as a replacement for the current preview capability. And in sort of usability tests of Drupal a couple of years back, this capability was identified as something that CMS users really find powerful and useful in working with CMS, particularly one they're not particularly familiar with, because it gives them immediate feedback on, as they make changes to different fields in CMS, is that producing the expected result within the output that they're creating. And finally, we already talked a little bit about AI in sort of Q&A earlier. Here's an example of using the OpenAI module that Dries was using. To me, there are potentially some limitations around using AI for sort of pure content generation. A number of us have probably seen documentation examples of some of the hallucinations that AI can generate. If you ask it for anything that it has to include sort of factual information like a biography on a public person, it often will sort of inject things that are completely made up. So it's not reliable as a way of sort of anything that has to have factual content. It's also limited in terms of its ability to understand anything that's recent. So as of right now, I think the OpenAI models are about 2 years behind in terms of the information that they have. So they're useful for providing, I would say, like broad level themes on well understood topics, but not necessarily anything more detailed than that. But to me, the really exciting potential of generative AI is more around augmenting the metadata for sort of human-generated content. So you can see here an example of taking an article, a long-form article, and then having AI suggest titles for that content. Or you can do things like have it create a summary for you, because we know that editors oftentimes don't take the trouble to manually write a summary. And so being able to sort of lighten that effort allows us to really deliver on the power sometimes of content models that we design, but then end up having to use a fallback strategy like truncating the new body field, which doesn't necessarily always do a good job of representing the full content of the piece of or the article or whatever it is that we're trying to represent. So using AI in these contexts allows editors to be much more efficient, but really deliver a better experience for visitors as well. So the last thing that I wanted to do is talk a little bit about what's the process to moving Drupal 10, because hopefully you've heard enough to be on board and want to get started along that path. So as it was mentioned before, people are hailing Drupal 10 as kind of the easiest to reach a version upgrade. Certainly in recent memory, maybe ever. Certainly if you look at the number of contrib projects that were available on day one, we can see that there was lots of engagement in the community in terms of really getting all of those contrib projects ready before even the first stable release. So if you're already on 8 or 9, the process for moving to Drupal 10 is definitely going to be much more straightforward. So you're going to use tools like the upgrade status and vector modules that will give you feedback on which projects you need to update in your custom code, what are some of the areas where you need to go and get some of your, let's say, custom modules ready. But if you're on Drupal 7 or earlier, certainly there is that rich migrate ecosystem that you can leverage. Tools like, or contrib projects like migrate tools that are going to make that progress easier. There is also an Acquia product called Acquia Migrate Accelerate that can sort of layer on a level of automation in terms of both the content architecture and content migrations, as well as suggesting replacement modules for like Drupal 7 modules you might have been using that don't have sort of Drupal 9 or 10 equivalents. In terms of your custom code, there is a project called the Module Upgrader, so you can definitely look into that. The other thing you might want to look into is a newer project called Retrofit that offers the potential to use your existing Drupal 7, let's say custom modules on a Drupal 10 site. And so that has, I think, some exciting potential. Potentially even down the road, there's talk that it might allow you to use your Drupal 7 theme on a Drupal 10 site. Although I think, as Suzanne correctly pointed out, it's probably a good opportunity to look at sort of a design refresh anyway. So that's the content that I brought. I did also bring some Drupal 10 stickers. So if anybody wants one, find me after the talk. So with that, I'll happy to open it up for questions.
For certifications, Acquia, if you're looking to start being certified, should you just jump right into D10 certifications, or should I look into? I don't know if like the certifications are already set for D10 or is still on.
So there are certifications for D10. I have to confess I haven't looked that closely at them myself. Last I heard there was one to be, so if you were D9 certified, you could get sort of a I want to say like a booster shot, but sort of the equivalent of just sort of demonstrating you understand the differences between the two as opposed to having to be sort of fully recertified. I'm not 100% sure the status of that one, but I definitely have seen people already getting their D10 certifications. I think there was just another question at the back.
When you make a pitch for Drupal 10, say against other CMSs, what's your kind of main talking points about ease of use, say compared with WordPress? And I'm asking not for a list, but what I find is that in some ways WordPress has defined usability as the WordPress itself. So coming up with a bunch of features doesn't usually happen. Just ignoring that kind of more complex ways of describing it. Past that. WordPress is easier.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I feel like the challenge, so if if you're talking about, a brochure site of 5 pages, there's very low complexity, Drupal may actually not be particularly well suited for those very, very simple sites. To me, as somebody who's very experienced with Drupal, it would probably be easier for me to do it in Drupal than something that I'm not familiar with, like WordPress. To me, where the power of Drupal really comes in is when you're dealing with organizations that have more complexity in terms of what they need to create. If there are other systems that they need to tie into, if maybe there are lots of requirements around the ability to associate different kinds of content together, that's where sort of the very powerful content modeling within Drupal really becomes a more powerful asset. So if it's just sort of standalone, a simple set of pages, it may be a tougher sell to sort of pitch Drupal in those scenarios. I feel like it's more, again, it's the idea of the ambitious site builder is really where it makes it much easier to deliver on the value proposition of Drupal. Does that answer your question?
Probably not. No. It's probably because it's a too broad a question. So here's a good example of there's lots of little things that people get stuck with Drupal. And one that comes up all the time for me is people hate using Drupal or any CMS to do the writing because they're used to writing whatever they got. So then their Word document copy and paste from Word actually all the time. So I think that you got that in 5 a little bit, but it seems like it's a problem that's lived for way too long that needs to be dealt with better. Copy and paste from Word. How do you deal with that?
So specifically on copy and paste from Word, there is a module for that. I think it's actually called Cicada 5 paste filter, something like that. That being said, I feel like if you can set the default as being restricted HTML as the default, a lot of times if you paste into that from Word, it's going to clean up a lot of that garbage markup anyway. So part of it is really just choosing the right tool. If most content doesn't need to have classes and all kinds of other markup on every element within the page, using something like restricted HTML is going to do a great job of allowing people to effortlessly paste in content from other systems without all of that garbage markup as well. So there's, again, like a lot of things with Drupal, lots of different ways to solve that kind of a particular challenge. Any other questions?
Hello, my name is Andrew from Montreal.ca. So first things first, for the CK35 paste filter module, we contributed it. Just want to give a shout out to my team at Montreal.ca and to the service. So if you're interested, feel free to check out Drupal.org. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. My question is, so in your presentation, you mentioned that in Drupal 10, there has been some improvements in terms of JS minification. So from my experience with Drupal 9, there has been some trouble with using CSS, JS consolidation and minification when, let's just say, when the site architecture is complicated. So for example, when the site is behind a CDN, or if the site uses a different file system like S3. So I'm just wondering, are you aware that in Drupal 10, the CSS, JS minification and consolidation improves and it works better for sites with complicated architectures? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I do know that there have been cases where using the on-the-fly minification in 10.1 in particular has created some challenges. So as with a lot of things in Drupal, you're going to want to test whether some of these new features actually improve things for you. I know, as a very simple example, probably a lot of people in the room have used the advanced aggregation module over the years. Probably less so in sort of modern versions of Drupal, but I know there's a pending issue that, like if you go to the project page today, it says if you're on 10.1, basically don't use the module and wait for kind of rewriting the module. So, some of these things, because they're, trying to move the project forward in sort of deeper, more technical ways may create some challenges, in the way that they impact, as you say, more complex sites, and so you have to sort of thoroughly test all of these things on your own projects before you sort of obviously make that jump forward. Other question? Any other questions?
Sorry, this might be out of scope of topics right now. I'm just wondering on Drupal.org, is there, so around like 6-month release cycle now, is there anything on Drupal.org around that speaks to non-technical people? So we're a nonprofit, all our projects are government funded. The one problem with government is it's hard to explain to them that once you have a website, it doesn't mean that you don't need to have any more funding for additional development, for example, for 6 months or whatever. A lot of people still seem to think that once you build it, that's it. So I'm just wondering if there's anything on Drupal.org that maybe speaks more on that kind of level.
That's a good question. So I definitely know there is a page on Drupal.org that sort of talks to the 6-month release cycle. Sometimes it'll have a little bit of kind of roadmap information. The challenge, I guess, is that because what's included in those releases is always community driven. Basically, we don't know 100% of what will be in that upgrade until essentially the first alpha release, at which point any new features being developed get pushed to sort of that next incremental release. Yeah, I mean, I would say in terms of explaining the value, it's almost like oil changes for your car, right? It's like you can't just buy a car and assume you drive it off the lot, and then you can drive it until it breaks, but it's definitely much less expensive to do sort of the ongoing maintenance of keeping it up to date as well. So maybe that doesn't do enough to answer the question, but maybe happy to talk to you offline afterwards if it helped to address that more. Yep. Was there another question up front here? Oh, okay.
Thank you so much, Martin.
Yeah.
Big round of applause again.
Thank you.